everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I am Katie, joined by Chris and John, who are the top two spots today. On today's show, we're talking about using Google Data Studio with Google Analytics 4. So the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about some of the tips and tricks that you need to know about using Google Analytics 4. And today we wanted to focus on the reporting side of it. A lot of people will be finding themselves in a position where they have existing reports that they need to transition over to Google Analytics 4, and a lot of people will be creating net new reports. And so we wanted to walk through some of that with you today as pretty much a demo of how to, knowing that the dimensions and metrics in Google Analytics 4 and Universal Analytics are not exactly one-to-one. So Chris, where do you want to start today?
Well, let's see. Let's take a look at a dashboard maybe and think about like how do we do this process. So here is one of the Trust Insights dashboards that we've got in Google Data Studio. As folks may remember, Data Studio is the preferred reporting method in the Google marketing platform. So Google has made it pretty clear with their design intent. You're supposed to do configuration in Tag Manager. You're supposed to do actual analysis in Google Analytics. And you're supposed to do reporting in Data Studio. And so what we have here is some of our reporting. So, Katie, should we just get started?
Yeah, let's just get started.
All right. No, you're not supposed to say that.
No, so I thought we were going to. So with everything, when you do an exercise like this, if you're moving reports from system to system, it's an opportunity to step back and redefine the user story and the business requirements. And so when I look at this, knowing personally that this was built a couple of years ago and the business has evolved and the dashboard hasn't, the first thing we want to do is restate the user story. As a person, I want to do a thing so that here's the outcome. And then you can check it against your existing dashboards to say, are these dashboards meeting the needs that I have to get me to the outcome that I'm looking for? Does it answer the question being asked? So that's where you start.
Exactly. So there's two things: the user stories and whether your dashboards fulfill that intent, and then the access and the administrative stuff. Who still needs access to this thing? It's just like transitioning a Google Analytics account. By the way, this mind map, we're going to make this a PDF. I'm going to put it in the Analytics for Marketers Slack group. So if you'd like to get this, which has all the links that we're going to be talking about, it'll be over in Analytics for Marketers. So, Katie, this is your dashboard of our KPIs as a company. Now, does this for you still fulfill kind of what we're trying to figure out?
It doesn't. Because last December, one of the things that we did internally was that we rearranged our goals in Google Analytics to follow more of our funnel. So the awareness, engagement, and conversion. And this report does not reflect that change. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is, when I look at this and I see that bucket of any thank you, that's too vague because there's too many things that fall into that. So that would be the second thing that I would change, is I would break that out more discreetly.
All right. So the first step in the process for doing a migration is this: make a copy of it, please. Do not edit your live dashboard. You will be sorry. You'll be very, very sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this.
I feel like that's really good advice for a lot of things. Never edit the live thing, make a copy of it, and then you can always replace it.
Exactly. And one of the other things that is super useful with Google Data Studio, relatively new, is under the file menu, go to publishing settings and turn on manual publish. What this does is this is effectively allows you to make changes to a Data Studio report now. But if the report's already in production, the users won't see it, the changes you're making, until you go ahead and publish it. So make sure that you turn that on. That way, even if you don't do this whole like staging versus production environment, this is sort of a ad hoc way of creating a staging environment.
That's so smart.
Right. It's great they didn't name that sandbox. That would make way too much sense.
I mean, draft version. The draft version makes sense because that's the terminology used in Google Docs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So the next step in the process, after you've cloned it and you made a copy, one of the big things that Google has a tendency to do is to make changes to the data sources themselves. So the first place we go is we go into the resource menu and look at our data sources. Right. So these are all of the data sources that are connected to this dashboard. This might be a bit much. So one of the things we would want to do, and we're not going to do it live here because nobody wants to watch us click around this, is go through and figure out, are these all needed, or can we retire and remove some of these, because clearly some of these might be a bit on the hefty side.
Yeah, and then it's also, in addition, it's an opportunity to double check your governance. So one of the things that we covered on a different episode with all of these data sources is that we ourselves failed a bit in the proper naming conventions as we were bringing these data sources in. So we've tried to clean some of it up, but we're not clear about who these data sources belong to.
Exactly. So this one here, for example, all website data, this is actually somewhat problematic. So I'm going to change this to Trust Insights GA3 account. Mm-hmm. That way, it's clear when we're working with GA3 and GA4, which one is which.
Yep.
So let's go ahead and hit done on that. The next thing to do, especially with Google Analytics 4, anytime you're editing a dashboard, it's a good practice, is to go into your GA4 property, hit reconnect, and look for any changes in the number of fields, right? You could even hit the refresh fields button. Every now and again, Google adds new stuff, and they don't tell you, and it doesn't update. So you have to go do that yourself in order to make sure that you've got essentially the latest version.
Okay. And so I'm assuming that, updating this is not as easy as just switching the data source from GA3 to GA4. Like, I'm guessing that would probably break some things.
That would break everything.
Oh, good.
and this is where things get really challenging. Is we're gonna go through essentially piece by piece and figure out what needs to be changed. So here's I guess the challenging part. All of the metrics that we see here from Google Analytics 3, because this is fundamentally a Google Analytics 3 dashboard, do not necessarily have equivalents in GA4. So part of our homework before we begin is to essentially do inventory. What data do we have here? So we have all goal completions, users, new users, returning users, bounce rate, session duration. Our next stop is to figure out, do these GA3 fields have an equivalent? Now, here's the interesting part. If you search for in Google's documentation, comparing metrics, right, to how do you translate universal analytics to GA4, you get a moderately helpful guide to how Google looks at some of these data points, how they convert them. One very interesting thing, by the way, in the documentation here, this one here is going to throw people for a huge loop. Universal Analytics counts one conversion per session for each goal, right? So if a user submits the form twice, only one conversion is set. So it's effectively unique conversions. GA4 says, we count every conversion event. If a user submits the same form twice, you have two conversions instead of one, which is a big difference, especially if you have a complex form where people can keep hitting the buttons, they're not sure what's going on. So there are some pretty substantial changes. Here's another fun one. Bounce rate is gone, right? So if we think back to our dashboard here, our bounce rate, well, that metric's not going to make it. Instead, we're going to have to replace it with engagement rate. Here's the bone I have to pick with Google about this. This is a good introduction, especially for non-technical folks. But if you are building a Data Studio dashboard, by definition, you're pretty much doing software development, right? You may not be writing code, but you're making a piece of software that end users are going to use. When you go to search for what's changed, this is not helpful from a dev perspective. And the documentation for what's actually changed unhelpfully lives in Google's developer portal, right? So this is now line by line. This is what the field was named in the old data API. This is what's named in the new API. So there's a field, for example, called active users in GA4. It is different than any of the old universal analytics fields. So it's a new metric, but then there's also a total users field. And so if you're sitting here going, which should I use, active users or total users, it's not which one is the best choice. So you're going to keep this page very in the old Data Studio. And reminder, Data Studio uses the Google Analytics API for all of its data. So we have source medium in the old one. Now it's called session source because there's now also a first user source, which is essentially first touch. And there's also a field that's named source, but is actually conversion source, which is documented somewhere in here. Either way, this is not particularly intuitive. So as you're building you're translating your reports in Data Studio from one to the other, you've got to know the translations that Google has set up behind the scenes.
We'll drop links to these pages in our Analytics for Marketers Slack group. And if you're not a member of that free Slack group, you can join for free at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. I know for sure I will be referencing those links, those resources quite a bit because I'm already confused.
Believe me,
it doesn't take much.
It's one of those things. This one is really important for e-commerce because you'll notice that not only are there totally different field names, there's actually built-in different hierarchies. So instead of old category hierarchy, you now have a flattened set of item categories for up to 5 categories. So if you're doing an e-commerce change for trying to report on your e-commerce site in Data Studio and GA4, you have to have done the configuration correctly in Tag Manager and in GA4 in order for e-commerce to work properly. And not everything has the most intuitive names. So there's that.
I think I've asked you this question before, Chris, but has Google made any kind of a statement as to why they've made such a radical change to the system and why they've made it essentially more difficult to use?
They've not made a statement, but the reason for it is because this is all Firebase. This is actually all Google Firebase. Under the hood, Google Analytics 4 is nothing more than Google Firebase. And so when they migrated the Firebase database and basically called it GA4, they kept all the Firebase stuff under the hood. And so all the field names things are actually a reflection of Firebase's architecture, not Google Analytics.
And for those who don't know, what is Google Firebase?
Google Firebase is Google's mobile app analytics software. So if you're a mobile app developer, you would use Firebase in your app to tell you, what parts of the screen people are tapping on and how fast your pages are loading and what people are swiping on in your app. And now with GA4, you see that heritage showing up so that when you have a data stream for your website and you have a data stream for your mobile app, you can now sort of see one view of the customer in one place. But it really is just a reskin of Firebase.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and so I mean, this is like a 20-year upgrade, really, right? It's like mobile first, and finally jettisoning some text back from the days of Gopher.
Exactly, and to a blog post you put up recently, John, on the Trust Insights website, it's not an upgrade in the traditional sense. It's not like when you uninstall Microsoft Word 2021 and you install Microsoft Word 2022 and you just go to work. It's a new app. It's a new app. Your data doesn't move over. So the day you install GA4 is day one of your ability to look back and stuff. So certainly one of those things we were cautioning people to make sure you do the transition sooner rather than later. So the next step of what we want to do here is we're going to take this set of metrics here. I'm going to copy and paste them. And then one by one, we're going to change the data source on them, like you said, Katie, from our GA3 to GA4. Right, and so now goal completions, we're going to look for conversions. And so this is so we have now changed, and you'll notice here there's kind of a big difference.
Yeah, that if you hadn't just explained to me what the difference was, I would be like, something broke.
Exactly. And so if you see this, and you're like, that doesn't look right. One of the first things to do is go into Tag Manager and GA4 and see how did we define our conversions, right? Do you have more conversions or different conversions set up in GA4 than you do in GA3? In this case, I know we do because we've set up some very different conversions in GA4. I want to say that more closely mirror those goals that we talked about back in December. So this is probably actually closer to correct. Next, let's do users. And as we just read about, we have active users, new users, and total users. Because we're trying to do the GA3 equivalent, we're going to use total users. If you have a mobile app, you probably would use active users instead, because active users only triggers when somebody has actually tapped open your mobile app and is actively using it, as opposed to it just being installed and present and sending data back. Whereas we only have a website, so you can't really have the Trust Insights app, a website on your phone, and not be looking at it. It's kind of hard to do.
And so remind me now, so we're looking at about 6,000 users difference. And that's because between Universal and GA4, Google has defined these two metrics as different, even though they are meant to be equivalent.
Exactly. So you have things total number of users, and they do kind of somewhat explain how those things differ. For example, Universal Analytics uses client ID while GA uses user ID. And there's a lot of other stuff that is questionable in here. So here's one of the gotchas. In GA3, there's a setting you can turn on that says exclude bots and spiders. It's not in GA4. So that 6,000 user difference may very well be that.
So basically, this is going to create chaos. Okay, just checking.
Sure is.
Let's
go ahead and do our new users.
Just a process question. So you copied all of those individual scorecards over, and now you're changing the data source. Could you basically capture all of them at once and change the data source once, even though you have to go through and update the metrics? Okay, so you could. That's exactly
you absolutely
what I was asking.
Okay. I'm doing it one by one just so that we can talk them through.
Right. I was just more so curious.
Yeah. So returning users, this is going to be a tricky one to do because it doesn't exist in GA4.
Well, if I recall correctly, I created a filter for returning users in GA3, in the GA3 version of this dashboard. It was total users minus. Yeah, that's what I did.
Right. I think I forgot to do the fielding properly. There we go.
So technically it doesn't exist in Data Studio for GA3 either. It was a calculation that I created.
Okay. And now we should have our returning users metric.
Wow, these numbers are just all over the place.
They really are. Bounce rate, as we know, doesn't exist.
Right, that's engagement now.
We're going to change that to engagement rate. Right? Which is interesting because it's the inverse if you think about it, if 90% of your traffic bounces, then 10% of your folks have stayed engaged with it. Whereas if 90% of your folks are engaged, only 10% have said, we're out of here. And so this number is actually a reversal of the previous.
I was going to ask about that because I was looking at before you started making the copy. It was like it's the red, it's down, but isn't that a good thing for this particular metric?
So red is okay for bounce rate. It's bad for engagement rate.
Okay, got it.
So you want more engagement, but fewer
Less
bounces. Right?
Oh, Google.
Let's do duration here. So we don't have a session duration at all. This is a question of, okay, how do we want to deal with the fact that this simply just does not exist?
Well, and this goes back to the user story and rewriting the business requirements. Is that a metric that we're going to make a decision on now moving forward versus when we put this dashboard together 3 or 4 years ago? And so in this particular instance, the answer is yes, because one of the things that we internally are working on is the stickiness of our website. So right now, for those who don't know, like people come to our website, get what they need, and then leave and don't come back a whole lot. And so that's one of the things internally that we're working on as one of our tactics. And so over time, this is a number that I would want to see and see it go up. But how we calculate it in GA4, I have no idea.
Right. So one of the things that we would want to do is go to the actual documentation for not Data Studio, not GA4, but go to the documentation for the data API. Because remember, Data Studio uses the data API as its source of data, and find, is there anything in the metrics table here that would be close to an equivalent, something that we could use that would fit, tell us, can we tell us how much time is somebody spending on page? And just going through a quick browse through here, screen page per session, not really. User engagement duration looks promising. Total amount of time, seconds, your website, I don't know, is in the foreground of users. So let's see if that is available yet. That has not made it into Data Studio yet. So it's in the data API, but it has not been included yet in Data Studio. So that one's going to be one we're going to have to park that.
Mm-hmm.
And we might even want to.
Yeah, that's going to be part of the frustration as, users are trying to recreate these reports, that they may be having their full set of requirements in their user stories. The data just may not exist. And for us, because it's the three of us, that's okay. We can get by without it, but that's not true for everybody, especially, a marketing manager whose CMO is saying, but I need to know.
Exactly. And so one of the things that you may want to do in the process as you're migrating a dashboard is actually do what we're doing right now, which is a live side by side, so somebody can look at it and go, what the heck is going on? Right? How do you have 21,000 returning users in GA3 and 481 in GA4? Like, how does that even work? How do you have that many more new users and total users just from the exact same tags on the exact same website, having almost double the number of users? How does that work? And that's where, again, a lot of these resources provided by Google, not to marketers, but to developers, will be helpful.
Yeah, how can you have more returning users than total users?
Well, that's a GA3 one, so we'd have to go back.
GA3 one.
That's a GA3 one, so we'd have to go back and look and see how was that constructed. It looks like it's actually based on page views.
Okay.
So there's also a scoping issue there.
Mm-hmm.
So that we've started doing some of these conversions. Now, here's where things are probably going to get a little bit ugly. Let's go ahead and
because that hasn't been looking ugly yet.
It's not been bad yet. These are just basic top level metrics. So let's go ahead and clone our goal completions by source here. And let's go. So now, one of the nice things is we're starting to see like all the different conversions that we've got set up. Like no, that's GA3. So I need to switch this to GA4. So let's put this to conversions instead of views. Right, so these are conversions, but these are all conversions. So we have to, if you want to be able to specify a conversion event, like say, I only want to see certain conversions, you will now have to, instead of having the different goals available, as you saw in GA3, we have to filter it. Let's call this any thank you. And then identify the event by its name equal to thank you. I believe that's what we named it.
Well, that goes back to the governance of everything and making sure that you're naming everything correctly and in such a way that you can easily find it.
Right. I appear to have not done that.
Well, so let's take a look at newsletter instead.
I'm actually going to pull open my GA4 property.
Also not a bad thing to have open when you're building these new reports.
So any thank you has underscores in it. Dang it. That's still not right. Because I filtered on the... Oh, you know what? It's the event. I'll bet you it's the event.
John, do you have any Data Studio dashboards built for the Marketing Over Coffee site?
I think we have one just kind of generic users, but no, it's not like that's at the top of our monthly reporting list. We're definitely a lot more ghetto than that.
I would be, you know what? I think it would be interesting if we were to go through this exercise with your report, even if it is a simple report, so that, we can then, speak to those audience members, those prospects and clients who are going to run into the same, like, well, I just have a simple report. Here, you still have to follow these steps. And so that way we can have even more practice doing that. Because what we want to do is transfer all of the Trust Insights reports, which will take some time. But if we can demonstrate on the set of Marketing Over Coffee reports, which sounds like it's a smaller book, then we'll have that complete. Here's what it was, here's what it is, and here's what the process looked like.
Yeah, and it's great just to get that feel for, as there's no substitute for this process right here of flipping the switches and saying, "Oh my God, this is totally broken. What went wrong?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that appear to have gone wrong here. I'm going to actually figure out. No, I'm serious. The thing that we're looking at here is, I'm going to just take these out for space, is I can see within the data itself, I've got my sources and mediums and I've got my different events, right? Mm-hmm. But for some reason, I'm not able to execute a filter on that thank you event, even though that's what's properly named. So this is one where it's like, okay, I'm going to spend some time beating on this to figure out why that particular filtration mechanism doesn't work. But this is like I said, a big change from GA3, where each goal was broken out separately. And you could easily say, I want to see goal 3 completion. I want to see goal 5 completions and stuff. Now we're going to have to do it by the conversion, by filtering for each of the individual conversion types that are in GA4. So it's one of those things, like it's more flexible, and it is more, I guess, customizable. But it also has the capacity, as we're seeing right now, to go totally off the rails because if you don't have proper governance, you're going to be sitting there comparing, like, what did I do wrong here?
Yeah, it does look like they're case sensitive. That's one thing. I see 2 of them up there.
Well, and our reports are not that complicated. And so if you think about, businesses where each goal is tied to a different business line, it has a different set of stakeholders and has very specific definitions, it's going to get that much more complicated, where ours is not that complicated and we have 100% control over every single data input. And John, it looks like you cracked the code.
I get the bug stomper of the day. How about that? That
Exactly.
never happens.
So now we're looking at the sources for the this is the any thank you conversion on the website. Where are we getting those conversions from?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the nice thing is we could then split this out for our other conversion events, like is this the first visit, which is the equivalent of a new user, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. We do have a question, Chris. Have you had any issues clustering date charts by year and month? I have had very odd totals that do not match scorecard chart counts. I'm assuming between the two different systems.
No, that's actually a Data Studio thing in itself. Data Studio has some funky date handling, and so you'll notice like there's day, date, day, week, and a variety of other date fields in there, and I've run into issues where the totals don't match up. Now, there's two reasons. There's two big reasons for that. One is you're using the wrong variable for date aggregation, which can get you into trouble because it will have essentially the data glued together incorrectly. The other problem depends on your GA3 or GA4 account and how much traffic you have. One of the challenges, let me see if this will trigger on this one. No, it didn't trigger on this dashboard. One of the challenges with Google Analytics, both the free and the paid version, is the more data you request, the more likely you're going to hit a sampling limit. And the sampling limit essentially is Google statistically sampling your data. And you will then be at a point where you may have two charts measuring the same thing, but in slightly different ways. And you'll get different numbers for what seems like it should be the same thing. We just ran into this with one of our clients. We had a month over month chart of their users, and they had a chart looking at 1 month of their users. And the two had different numbers, and it was off by about 2%. It turns out the month over month chart was sampling data at a rate of 3.5%. The individual month was sampling at 46%. So there's a huge gap between the two in terms of how much data was being returned, which is kind of a pain in the butt.
If you had it hosted over on data BigQuery, would that make that go away because you've got all your own data?
Yeah, so if you were to put all that into BigQuery and use the BigQuery integration with GA4, and then you're building your reports in Data Studio with your BigQuery data, then yes, you'll avoid the sampling issue. Or the other option is if you really care about it, you can pay the $250,000 or whatever a year for Google Analytics 360.
Mm-hmm.
Is Google Analytics 360, does it include Google Analytics 4?
So it's a separate version. So there's essentially Google Analytics 4 360.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, I feel like, we can't solve all the problems of Google not having everything, available, everything being a one-to-one. However, one of the things that we can be doing now is auditing all of our reports, going back through the user stories, making sure that we have all the requirements, because again, sort of as we stated at the top of this live stream, our goals and KPIs have changed in the 3 or 4 years ago when we built these reports initially. So it's an opportunity for us to go back through. And so some reports may stay unchanged because we want to keep the same metrics. But, some of these reports, we're going to say, you know what, that metric isn't important anymore, or it's missing the following 3 things in order for us to have the complete story. So this is the time as Google is adding more things continually, to be doing that documentation so that, come Q3 and Q4, that's when you're rebuilding the report. So use this time now to do all of your user story and documentation of requirements.
Yep. And remember, so like I just realized I used the wrong field for source. I used the conversion source instead of session source. So you're going to want to have really, really good QA. As we said, the bottom part of the process is you're going to want to have QA with the user stories and a technical QA. It's, again, like real software development. Hey, did you use the right fields on this report? And someone else checking your work to say, yes, this is the correct field, or this is not the correct field. That step, I guess it was never really optional, but there were so many people who were so well versed in GA3 that you could spot things pretty easily. With not a lot of folks skilled up yet on GA4, you really are going to want to have more than one set of eyes on this stuff.
And it goes back to having those detailed business requirements, because let's say, Chris, you built a report and you asked me to QA it. The first thing I'm going to ask you is, what the heck am I looking for? How do I know if something isn't correct? Because as you just stated, not a lot of us are skilled up on GA4 yet. So we are going to be dependent on those business requirements in order to do proper QA.
Exactly. And the last thing I would advise is, if you go into file report settings, there's an option for to put a Google Analytics account in here. I would strongly advise for anybody who's doing work with Data Studio that you have a Google Analytics account just for Data Studio reports, so that you can see which reports are getting viewed. So this workbook here has 19 pages in it. And when you pull up a measurement account, you can see which of these 19 reports gets viewed the most. And over time, I would actually do this sooner rather than later, so that when it comes time to do your migration, if you've got a report that's gotten 0 views for the last 3 months, you probably don't need to migrate that one. You probably say, we're just going to let this one just fade away.
Well, and that comes with part of the requirements is how often do people need to look at this report. So there are some reports that I look at maybe about twice a year. And so that 3-month timeline in that context wouldn't work. But if we had stated up front, this report gets looked at twice a year, this report gets looked at annually, this one gets, build that into your requirements. So then when you're comparing that against that Google Analytics view report, then you can see, okay, that checks out, that makes sense.
Yep. So what have you learned today, kids?
Go break all the things.
Not a lot. What we learned is, there is a way to approach transferring your reports from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. We're going to post some of those resources in our free Slack group. We also learned that Google Analytics 4 is going to be the system of record. However, Google hasn't released everything that you need yet. So spend this time doing your documentation on what you will need, so that when things are released, you can add it in. And if you want help with that, then, that's what we do.
Exactly. We had one last question asking if we have a preference for user versus session totals. And the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. So sessions are a good measurement for assessing marketing effectiveness. How did you generate that session? User totals are good for measuring the number of people that did a thing. So if you, for example, are looking to try and compare what's coming through Google Analytics with what shows up in your marketing automation system, your marketing automation system is based probably on contacts, which are people. So you'd use users as the comparable metric in that situation. On the other hand, if you're trying to figure out doing multi-touch attribution, you want to say, okay, what marketing channels are working best? You care about getting eyeballs on your content or form fills or whatever, sessions is the better choice in that case. But it is always a question of what is the goal, right? What is the user story? What is the thing you're trying to make a decision on? And then what metric maps most closely to that?
John, parting words?
Do this sooner than later, man. You don't want to be doing this on May 2023. That would be very painful.
I would agree with that.
All right, folks, we'll see you all next week. Take care. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.